Morning by Steve Gomez, who's our Chief Financial Officer, and then online is Catherine Gessing, who's the agency's General Counsel. And I am hopeful between the three of us, we'll be able to answer any questions you may have. So just going to start with kind of a quick overview of how federal funding fits into ANR's budget. We're focused on FY24 for purposes of this presentation. Can talk a little bit about the different types and sources of federal funding that ANR relies on for our work, as well as a bit of a risk assessment. And I just want to own up front that that particular piece of this conversation is incomplete at best, but happy to share what we currently know. So for perspective, ANR's FY24 budget was just north of $230 million. And roughly 40% of that amount was federal funds. Our budget supports about 650 full-time staff and then 400 seasonal employees that largely staff our state park system. And almost 3/4 of that $230 million budget ends up as pass-through grants, contracts, and loans to municipalities through things like our state revolving fund. Sometimes we hire contractors directly for some of our site remediation work, and then also partner organizations like conservation districts, regional planning commissions, and watershed organizations that help implement projects on the ground.
Pass-through grants. Can you explain? I've heard that before. I think I understand it, but just to clarify, do you have any jurisdiction over that money, or do you just manage it?
So generally, those monies have specific things they are for.
Yeah.
But beyond that, we typically have some amount of discretion to run a competitive process. In the case of our state revolving funds, we build each year what we call the intended use plan, or IUP, where there's a set of criteria that have been established in statute, and we rank projects according to those criteria. So it depends on the program, but generally they're not fully discretionary. It's not as if we receive $10 million and can do the best projects with it. It's $10 million for nutrient and sediment pollution reduction, or $10 million for drinking water system improvement.
Great.
Those types of dedicated uses. Sure. In terms of the federal money represented in that FY24 budget, it comes from 51 different places. So I think the important takeaway there is we have a lot of different federal funding sources. To date, of the $92.7 million that was in the FY24 budget, about 2/3 of that has been fully expended, which is what's captured in the SEPA report, which is what House Appropriations had asked us to focus on in sort of gathering this information. Although we have 51 different federal funding sources, 10 of those funding sources comprise about 90% of all expenditures, and 2 of them are responsible for over half. And those are our 2 state revolving funds, the ones for drinking water and then the ones for wastewater, which we call the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So in addition to having 51 different funding sources, they come from 7 different federal agencies and departments. The US EPA, probably is a surprise to no one, is the largest federal funder of work within ANR. But then we also receive significant funding from the Department of the Interior, much of which goes to the Fish and Wildlife Department, the Department of Agriculture, Transportation, and Homeland Security. The Homeland Security funding is really FEMA dollars that support work at the agency. And then we have 2 very small grants through the Defense Department and the Northern Borders Regional Commission. In terms of what we use those dollars for, 275 of ANR's 650 staff are either partially or fully funded with federal monies. It really runs the gamut from people who see 5% of their salaries sort of charged to a federal account, all the way up to people who are fully supported with federal funds. But if you take the total number of staff hours supported with those federal dollars and just convert it into full-time equivalents, it works out to be about 180 of our staff positions. So about a quarter. And then very much to your question, Representative Austin, there are some examples of the types of pass-through grants and contracts. Our state revolving fund loans in 2024 went out to more than 70 municipalities. The recreational trails program that's administered by the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, with money that comes in through the Department of Transportation, had grants out to 13 municipalities and nonprofits. And then our state wildlife grants. And I just tried to pick an example from each of the departments to give a sense for sort of how many partners are receiving money through these different grants out type programs. And then in terms of the risk assessment, there's really, at least what our learning has been to date, to be able to predict what federal programs could be reduced or eliminated. And then thinking about how any changes in those programs might cascade down to our subrecipients is even more challenging. There's also a number of other factors that are out there. Obviously, there have been innumerable legal challenges to many of the actions the current federal administration has tried to take. As of last week, my understanding was that they totaled more than 1,200. We also have a number of different funding sources that are actually multi-year. So multi-year apportionments of our Pittman Robertson and Dingell Johnson monies, which are excise taxes on the sales of hunting and fishing equipment at the federal level. That is what funds most of the work within the Department of Fish and Wildlife. That is a multi-year funding source. And then we also receive multi-year and overlapping awards from things like the Lake Champlain Basin Program or the Cooperative Federal Forestry Assistance Program out of USDA. And just to put a little more context to that, the Lake Champlain Basin Program right now is in the process of allocating their FY24 dollars out to states. They have all of that money in their possession. There's been no move to take those dollars back, and it will fund work for the next 3 years. So really where we would see were the basin program funding to be restricted going forward, that's probably a 2-year from now problem as opposed to a current year problem. And so that again complicates our funding picture in that the federal dollars in may not actually be part of any current federal budget conversation. And with that, I can stop there and happy to answer any questions you might have on the federal funding piece.
Do members have questions? Representative Pritchard and then Austin.
What does the state receive? What amount does the state receive through Pittman Robertson and Dingell Johnson? Do you know?
Steve, I know.
Yeah, so for the record, Steve Gomez, CFO at A&R. Pittman Robertson, it's usually somewhere between 5.5 and 6 million. Dingell Johnson's usually $3.5 to $4 million. And obviously those change because it's based on excise taxes, but those I would say are kind of the general numbers the department's seeing.
And what percentage of that is utilized by the Fish and Wildlife Department?
All of those dollars.
All.
Yeah, so that supports staff and it supports some grants, contracts, management of wildlife management areas, fishing access areas. Yeah. So
Thank you.
Representative Austin.
Yeah. I assume you're kind of doing different scenarios, like if this happens, this would be, what are you prioritizing? Is it safe to assume you're prioritizing clean water? Is that not safe to assume?
I think that's a hard question to answer, in part because we haven't been presented with sort of a comprehensive set of changes. They're all one-off, right? For example, this week you may have heard on VPR, we're dealing with the potential for the funding that supports our Eco AmeriCorps team to be pulled back, right? So right now we're focused in that space. I think the good news on the clean water side, the SRF are obviously big players, and we've done some analysis, which I'm also happy to share with this committee that House Appropriations had asked for, about sort of what happens if they stop capitalizing our state revolving fund grants. But most of the money in our clean water fund is state dollars. It's $30 million roughly of state general funds through the property transfer tax, the rooms and meals tax, and the unclaimed bottle deposits, $10 million from the capital bill, And then that last $10 million is federal money that generally flows through the Lake Champlain Basin program directly to ANR. But so 40 of the $50 million we're investing annually in clean water is state dollars.
Thank you.
I wonder, just as sort of add-on to Representative Austin's question, if push really does come to shove, what do you see as the critical services that ANR provides to the people of the state of Vermont for public health and safety that we need to really have front of mind?
Yeah, I think it is that public safety component that certainly we're most focused on. It includes things like the work of our dam safety program, and then the infrastructure support work in our drinking water and wastewater treatment programs. Those to me are critical public safety functions. You know, there are some other places where we have kind of emergency response functions also within the agency. I would say our river engineers play an important role during periods of extreme weather. We have a wildland fire team within FPR that was very active last summer, and we know there've already been a small number or a number of small wildfires this year. And then we have a team within the Fish and Wildlife Department that works on disease outbreaks and in cooperation with, at times, the Ag Agency and at times the Health Department and at times both. But those sort of public safety functions to me are of the highest priority.
And currently those are they primarily state funded? That I thought was a lot of long list, so.
I would say no.
Yeah.
The Fish and Wildlife Department relies heavily on those Pittman Robertson and Dingle Johnson monies to support the entire scope of services that they provide. But to me, the place I would be most concerned is our drinking water and groundwater protection program. The way that the staff in that program are funded is we're able to take a set aside from the federal SRF capitalization grant. And actually, I'm just going to pull up notes that I had sent to the House Appropriations Committee so I don't misspeak.
What did you say? You said SRF, what kind of funds?
The drinking water side.
No, but I mean,
Set aside.
that aside for administration kind of. Is that fair to say?
It essentially pays for nearly all of the staff in that in our public water supply program. So it's used to partially or fully fund nearly all staff in the public drinking water program. So if the drinking water state revolving fund capitalization grant is eliminated, and just those capitalization grants is each year the federal government since the 80s has offered us a certain amount of funding, and we are up to a ceiling, are able to, for every state dollar provided, draw down 4 federal dollars. From that pool of funding that has to go into drinking water projects, we are able to take sort of money off the top in the drinking water program that we call the set aside, and that's used to fund those staff positions. And staff have been clear that if we lose that capitalization grant and therefore those set asides, we will lack the capacity to fulfill our obligations under the Safe Drinking Water Act and would likely need to return that regulatory program to EPA. So to me, that's probably the place of biggest risk. In the other programs, there's risk, but there is a more substantial mix of state and federal dollars. This is a place where we are very reliant on federal funds for that work. And I do see public drinking water system management and oversight as a really critical public safety function we provide.
I think it would be helpful for us to have that kind of list of those critical functions and a little more, just a breakdown on their total budgets and how much is federal and state.
Sure.
I don't know what Approps has asked for, but maybe anyway, that would be helpful for us.
I think we have a chart that has a lot of that information together, and we can sort of highlight in it which of those are sort of those critical public safety functions.
Great, thank you. Representative Chapin.
Thank you, Secretary Mar. This is fascinating, helpful, enlightening. Because we're not the appropriations or leadership, all of us, could you just share a little bit about should the agency, and this obviously applies to all agencies and government as a whole, at the state level, should we lose something like that particular source that you just said, that, you know, for matching dollars for every $1 for staff that run a critical essential program for our state, you know, how much leeway does the agency have in in a given year to reallocate funding and staff? How much do you, and to what extent, does the legislature have to be there to make changes? Can you just walk us broadly through that? So it's a very elementary question.
Sure. So, you know, prior to these really significant federal funding programs, ARPA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and to a lesser degree, the Inflation Reduction Act, I always sort of use the talking point, ANR's budget is roughly 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 state general funds, 1/3 special funds. So permit fees, gate receipts from parks, money people spend to buy hunting and fishing licenses, 1/3 federal funds. And so we obviously have a lot more discretion and control over how we are investing those general and special funds than sort of what happens to the federal money. Both when it comes in, it's usually for a very specific purpose. And if it goes away, it will leave a hole in those specific programs. I think, you know, we do have some ability to adjust, but it is going to be hard and complicated. I might rely on Steve to say how deep down we can go before we would need to come back to the legislature. Obviously, we get money, for example, in DEC, we get an appropriation for the air programs, we get an appropriation for the water programs. And so I don't think we have the ability, absent the legislature's support, to kind of move funds across lines. But within lines, we may have some ability to adjust. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I would say it all of this really depends on the individual federal program. So like, for example, Pittman-Robertson dollars at Fish and Wildlife, like usually they have a small balance that they carry over from year to year because the appropriations from the federal government are available for 2 years. So, right, so like they could potentially maybe absorb a reduction in federal funds or some sort of impact. The same is true for the Cooperative Forestry Assistance Grant with the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation. Like those are multi-year grants that are 3 to 5 years. So if there's a direct impact in an individual federal fiscal year, those other grants may be able to carry on some of that work for a duration. So it really comes down to the impacted federal program in terms of what the flexibility is. I would say in terms of like the general fund dollars or special fund dollars that are in the agency, the only way to leverage those funds would be to reduce another program. So you would just be shifting the problem from one program to another, and maybe prioritization wise, that's something to consider, but that's essentially what would have to happen.
Correct.
And in terms of that shifting of particularly staff, do you have a fair amount of discretion at the agency level to do that in a timely manner? Is sort of my question.
Yeah, I mean, it starts to get into the collective bargaining agreement and other pieces that implicate that, but we do have some flexibility within those lines and are very hopeful it will not come to that.
Thank you.
Representative Pritchard.
Do you have a contingency plan that you're working on in case it does?
We do not, in part because there's so many different permutations that any funding reduction could possibly take. I don't know how we could sort of approach that other than understanding what are our highest priority public safety functions that we will seek to maintain.
Right, that makes sense. All right, we need to move on. We've asked the secretary here on a wide array of topics for an hour.
So next, I expect we want to talk about lakes in crisis. So the lakes in crisis statutes really focused on water body impairments, and Lake Memphremagog, which I understand to be of particular interest to the committee. The impairment is for aesthetics due to excess phosphorus. And we do have a TMDL, or total maximum daily load, which is essentially a pollution budget that is currently being implemented in Lake Memphremagog. There's a lot of strong parallels with the work we're also doing in Lake Champlain. We've been tracking very closely our investments in clean water since 2016, which was just after the General Assembly passed Vermont's Clean Water Act, Act 64. And we've invested $9.6 million or over $30 million, excuse me, to date in projects within the Lake Memphremagog Basin, including $9.6 million in state fiscal 24, which is the last year we have full data for. We report on the impact those dollars are having on the ground as part of the Clean Water Performance Report that's submitted to this body each year. And I think Emily Bird and Claire Madden may have been in here to talk about the Clean Water Performance Report. But essentially at this point, we're able to document, we have achieved about 17% of the phosphorus reductions required under the Lake Memphremagog TMDL.
What percent?
17.
17.
Mhm. And then, there are a number of efforts that support overall coordination and the work to improve water quality in Lake Memphremagog. This includes, we have a tactical basin plan for the Lake Memphremagog watershed, including the major river basins that identifies strategies to protect and restore water quality, not just in the lake itself, but in its watershed. We have quarterly meetings of the local Basin Water Quality Council, which was established under Act 76 and is made up of local clean water experts and helps guide the formula grant funding that comes out of the Clean Water Fund and is directed into that watershed where those projects will be deployed. And then we also, in some ways, sort of similar to the Lake Champlain Basin Program, have what we call the Quebec Vermont Steering Committee. And that entity meets twice a year and is intended to help ensure we are coordinated and collaborating with our partners in Quebec. As the committee may know, about 75% of the Lake Memphremagog watershed is in Vermont, but 75% of the body of Lake Memphremagog itself is in Quebec. And so we have a disproportionate role to play in ensuring water quality. And so, I think to me, the bottom line is we are making a tremendous investment in Lake Memphremagog and in watershed practices. We are starting to see the phosphorus reductions occur as a result of those investments and don't feel that a lakes in crisis designation is warranted for the listed impairment for that water body.
Thank you. I think that the concern is around chemicals, forever chemicals in the lake. And I know we're doing a lot. We've heard from Matt Chapman. We heard from you on that even a little while ago. But can you speak to that and whether or not the lake in crisis determination or designation would expedite addressing forever chemicals in the lake?
Sure. So maybe 3 summers ago now, we conducted a coordinated sampling monitoring event with our partners in Quebec to assess PFAS levels in particular within Lake Memphremagog, and I believe had only 1 sample where we even had detectable levels, concentrations of PFAS. We do not currently have state surface water quality standards for PFAS. We have groundwater standards and drinking water standards that mirror each other, but do not have surface water standards. That said, the intention in doing that synoptic monitoring survey was to determine whether or not there appeared to be high concentrations or concerning concentrations of PFAS in Lake Memphremagog. And I would say the results of that gave us confidence that it isn't present in significant concentrations. I say that because the Lakes in Crisis statute is really hitched to the cart of having it a water body appear on our impaired waters list. So without a standard, you can't have an impairment. That said, we just didn't see concentrations of PFAS chemicals in Lake Memphremagog. Certainly appreciate the concerns around PFAS and sort of its ubiquitous nature in modern life. And think that the work that's being done in this committee on the front end to help get these chemicals out of the stream of commerce is really important. I think the work we're doing on the back end with Casella through their pre-treatment permit to look at different PFAS removal technologies to help remove PFAS from landfill leachate is really important. And then continuing to make sure we aren't seeing concerning concentrations in surface water bodies. But the monitoring data we have to date does not show that those levels, that there are detectable levels generally in Lake Memphremagog.
Thanks. Representative Taglivia.
With respect to the lake and crisis designation and the lakes that have the designation right now, I don't recall seeing or hearing anything with respect to the cancerous lesions like on the bullheads that we've seen in Memphremagog. Are any of the lakes that have the lake and crisis designation, do they show signs of any fish that like we've seen come out of Memphremagog?
No, we only have one lake that's been designated a lake in crisis. It is Lake Carmi. It was also designated for as impaired by phosphorus. So that's it, it's the only one. Certainly we share the concern over the lesions being documented on brown bullhead in Lake Memphremagog. It's an area our Fish and Wildlife Department has been actively engaged in over a period of years, has done a significant amount of fish tissue sampling, bottom sediment sampling, particular attention to South Bay, where we know that those fish occur with the greatest prevalence. I understand from our local fisheries biologists that their current working theory is it may be being caused by a virus, but they haven't been able to substantiate that yet, but are working with partners in Quebec as well as with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to continue that investigation.
I think it's 2575 to designation. What part of Memphremagog is on our side of the boundary versus Canada's? And there's a pretty large basin from what I could see on the one map that I was looking at that actually flows from the US side into Memphremagog. What do we know about how much of any of the northern basin flows? Do we, just because we're only 25% of the lake surface, how much of the basin or the supply water comes from the US side versus the Canada side?
Sure, I think it's reasonable to assume that it's roughly proportional to the watershed area. And so of all the land area that drains into Lake Memphremagog, about 75% of that land area is in the US and 25% is in Canada. So it's not a perfect one-to-one, but that's it's a reasonable surrogate.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This bill contemplates removing the requirement for real estate values to be devalued in order to be deemed a lake in crisis. What are your thoughts on that?
I think those criteria were established for a particular moment in time. Clearly, Lake Carmi was in a pretty dire situation at the moment the Lakes in Crisis statute was envisioned. I'm not sure what the Lake in Crisis designation, frankly, would gain for a watershed like Lake Memphremagog. I believe strongly the agency has demonstrated a commitment to addressing water quality concerns in the lake and in the watershed, both through the work being funded out of the Clean Water Fund and then some of these separate initiatives around brown bullhead and even PFAS monitoring. The funding that comes with a Lakes in Crisis designation is just $50,000. Because we already have a robust TMDL and monitoring program in place for that watershed, I'm not sure that it would sort of change our approach. And as a result, I guess I personally don't see that it would have a lot of value add beyond the work that's already being done in this area.
How far are we on getting a PFAS surface water standard?
It would take a lot of resources. We had been, I think frankly, operating under the assumption, and I know what they say about assumptions, that EPA was moving in that direction and we would be able to rely on EPA. There's less and less likelihood that that's going to happen, at least in the near term, and know that there have even been challenges filed against the drinking water standards that EPA published less than a year ago. So a lot of moving pieces right now. To establish a surface water quality standard is a fairly significant technical undertaking. It's generally not done by individual states. It's something that tends to be done by EPA. I know that there are regional conversations taking place and maybe ways to do some of that data and labor sharing, but it is it's a known need, and I think it's a matter of how we prioritize our work in terms of the timeline for getting that into place if we are unable to rely on EPA to provide support.
Further questions for the secretary on this? Representative Chapin.
I just want to confirm, you sort of said several things that lead me to this, but I just want to confirm what I'm hearing is that there are working groups, collaborating groups across boundaries between US and Canada, our agencies and theirs, and hopefully probably other kinds of nonprofit organizations also involved, not just on the phosphorus piece for Lake Memphremagog, but other water quality concerns can rise up through those collaborative processes to be addressed. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, when we did the monitoring work several summers ago, our colleagues in Quebec also performed similar synoptic monitoring. So we had a fairly comprehensive
That
picture.
wasn't like a one-time opportunity.
I mean, on PFAS, it was like, that was a very intentional go out and try to collect data throughout the summer in a consistent manner so that we hopefully were able to paint a comprehensive picture for ourselves of in-lake PFAS concentrations. But no, we meet twice a year regardless. And it provides an excellent opportunity for that kind of collaboration and coordination. Another example of something that came out of one of those meetings unrelated to phosphorus was the delegation from Quebec had a lot of questions about the Coventry, Vermont landfill and its operation. And so we're able to arrange a tour with technical staff from our agency, some of their technical team, to be able to look at the different systems that are in place on the ground there.
And did the PFAS, the synoptic, which I'm not familiar with the term, but monitoring include looking at PFAS concentrations in the fish, in the ground bullhead?
I believe that work has been done. That was not part of that monitoring survey. It was just water column data that was collected.
But yeah, I know that work's done. We heard about it, but okay.
Pete Emerson out of our St. Johnsbury office has been leading that work on behalf of the Fish and Wildlife Department.
Right, well, we'll make sure we have time for yet another simple topic.
Yeah. Shift gears yet again. Thank you, Steve. If we rejoin. Oh, I'm still in the Zoom. Wow, I'm smarter than I thought I was. All right.
It takes a second.
All right.
Here you go.
Yes. So the last piece of information I am looking to share with you all this morning is a bit of an update on where we stand with the CAFO corrective action plan that EPA has asked us to develop, and then its nexus with S-124, which is a bill I understand will be coming soon to this committee. So just a little bit of timeline, background context on how we got here. What's not shown on this was that in the summer of 2022, the Conservation Law Foundation filed a petition with EPA indicating that they were seeking to have our ability to administer federal Clean Water Act discharge permits in this state withdrawn. It's called a dedelegation petition. It's not limited just to agriculture. It would also affect our ability to issue permits for wastewater discharges and stormwater discharges. But the concerns CLF raised were all around ag water quality permitting. EPA took time to review the concerns raised in the petition, to do some of their own investigation, which included reviewing files from ANR, files from the Ag Agency, information submitted by the petitioners, and they even did some of their own inspections of Vermont farms. And in September of last year, they sent us a letter and asked us to prepare, or directed us, I should say, to prepare a corrective action plan to address a series of deficiencies that they identified with how we are currently regulating CAFOs in Vermont. We had 90 days, and within those 90 days submitted a draft corrective action plan to EPA, and we have since been going back and forth. In January, by the end of January, they provided us draft feedback. I would describe it at the highest level of saying, this looks like you're headed in the right direction, ANR. We need to see some more details beyond what you've provided in this initial draft. In March, we submitted an updated draft, and included with that what was then S100, which has now been sort of pulled into S124, and for their reference and review. And we have continued to dialogue with EPA, and that March draft cap really reflects some of the input and feedback we've received. I sent that into the committee this morning. So the March draft should be with you all, and it includes the version of S100 we submitted with our draft cap, but acknowledging to them we were working with the General Assembly to make certain changes to support our ability to actually implement the corrective action plan. So getting into a few more specifics, this is kind of the high level summary of what those critical concerns were that EPA laid out in their September 2024 letter to us. One is that ANR needs to be the lead inspector on all medium and large farms to determine if a CAFO permit is required. And part of that inspection is we must first review the nutrient management plans for those farms to make sure they're consistent with state and federal requirements. We have obligations to comprehensively track permitting, monitoring, and enforcement actions. There is a database, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, that the Ag Agency has stood up, but we do not currently have access to that tool, or full access to that tool. ANR has to be the lead in enforcing against farms that are discharging without a permit. We need to have sufficient personnel, and that's been a consistent theme. We needed to update our statutory and regulatory authorities. They weren't quite in lockstep with current federal Clean Water Act requirements, and they were looking for us to propose a timeline for accomplishing this work. So we submitted our draft corrective action plan in December. We developed this draft in consultation with the Ag Agency, and really focused on aligning how we are regulating water quality on farms with the obligations under the Federal Clean Water Act. And I should say the biggest gap that was identified in that regulation was essentially the Ag Agency, through its large farm operating and medium farm operating permit programs, holds farms to a no discharge standard, meaning they can't have any discharge that leaves their farmstead or barnyard area. The CAFO program, farms should have to have CAFO permit coverage if there's evidence of a discharge. And what EPA pointed to is a number of instances where a discharge was documented and a farm was given time to address the discharge while remaining under an LFO or MFO permit. And what EPA said is the Clean Water Act doesn't provide time to come into compliance. If there is a discharge that can't be immediately and permanently corrected, that farm needs a CAFO permit. And so that gap is really what has led us into where we sit today. We proposed a 4-year implementation timeline from where we sit today to where EPA ultimately would like us to be. that more clearly defines the roles and responsibilities ANR has, makes clear ANR will be the lead on these joint inspections of medium and large farms, and propose that we will do at least 10 inspections this coming field season, knowing it'll take us a little bit of time to staff up. ANR is singularly responsible for determining whether or not a farm needs a CAFO permit, and that ag will continue to regulate farms that do not have discharges. That we are going to work together on a shared data management system, and there's money in the budget to essentially allow for ANR to build an interface into ag's existing data management system. So we'll have comprehensive farm records, but our own ability to input data and manage records according with the needs of our programs. Committing that we will review nutrient management plans prior to inspections. And one of the Clean Water Act requirements is that nutrient management plans need to be available for public review and inspection. We're going to update our CAFO rule and our medium farm general permit. We are going to commit to annual, or we have committed to annual progress reporting to EPA. In terms of staffing, we have an existing position within the Watershed Management Division that we're going to transfer into the CAFO program. In addition, the governor's budget includes 2 new positions for CAFO work, so that'll bring the total staff in that program to 5. And then the other piece is in December 2026. So this will give us 2 field seasons. We're going to reassess staff and resource needs and make further recommendations if needed. So by that point, we'll have conducted a number of farm inspections, and I think have a much clearer sense for the number of farms likely to require CAFO permits.
It's just, well, it's on my mind. What's not going to get done at the Watershed Management Division if you're moving somebody over? What's their job now?
This is a position within our environmental compliance division. And so in some ways it is a rejiggering of responsibilities and having a single position focused on agriculture, as opposed to having our entire compliance staff each have a geographic role in agriculture. So I don't believe functionally it will change how things are experienced on the ground for Vermonters, but it'll mean there's one person that's building expertise related to agriculture as opposed to our current more generalist approach.
So right now, that division has how many staff in it?
Have to confirm unless Catherine happens to know, but I believe there are 6 environmental enforcement officers statewide.
And they work geographically now.
Correct.
You would take one of them and convert them to focus on agriculture. Okay. Representative Labor.
Good morning. Thank you
Right.
for coming in. As A&R picks up the ball for boots on the ground, the expertise is actually historically with ag. You borrow any of their employees to assist, since they're not going to be doing the boots on the ground?
So we had talked with EPA about whether we could sort of deputize ag agency employees to help provide some of that capacity at ANR. They were not supportive of that approach, in that the Clean Water Act authorities really vest with the agency, and so staff would need to report through the Commissioner of Environmental Conservation and/or me for that to be satisfactory to them. So just borrowing employees was not sufficient. That said, currently the ag agency sends 2 inspectors out to each farm visit. Our proposal is it will now be 1 ANR and 1 ag agency inspector. And so we should benefit from some of that knowledge. And just to be clear, in this, there is no proposal to do anything different with the technical and financial assistance programs that are administered by the ag agency. So really ANR's role in this is to identify where discharges are occurring. The helping farmers solve those and eliminate those discharges will still stay with the ag agency and their team of engineers and agronomists and people who are able to provide that kind of direct technical advice.
Thank you.
So then in January, as I said, we got a letter back from EPA. And really they asked for additional information and kind of explanation about our commitments. They're listed here. I don't know that I need to read through them, but we've worked consistent with this feedback provided from EPA to offer essentially greater explanation in detail, milestones over the course of those 4 years about how we intend to approach this work, as well as making commitments about how our review of nutrient management plans, how we are going to go about identifying farms that are discharging, and then establishing some of those interim milestones that will allow us to demonstrate we are making adequate annual progress. And we documented all of that in the March 25 redraft that we submitted just over a month ago. So it further clarifies that separation of roles and responsibilities between ANR and the Agency of Agriculture. It confirms that we are solely responsible for making decisions about what is a CAFO. It provides some more detail on our inspection priorities and timelines, including a commitment to work with EPA to establish those 10 farms. We will inspect this summer to make sure we're reflecting where their concerns and priorities lie. And we did provide the language of what was S100, but now S124. And just why that was important is it demonstrates our commitment to implementing the CAP by making those conforming changes to Title 10 that EPA has identified as important. I don't think Catherine or I would suggest that this is necessarily the be-all, end-all of statutory changes that may be needed to have a fully functional CAFO program. But this is the right set of changes for sort of year zero and allows us to get going. One of the other things that happens in that bill is it really sets the framework for a robust stakeholder process to work with the agriculture community. One of the questions that I have heard on a number of occasions from farmers is CAFO is really a water quality permitting program. There are other things that ag reviews, particularly through their large farm operating permits, like traffic and odors and vectors, that don't come up under a CAFO permit. And so how are the LFO and CAFO programs going to fit together? And I think that will be a big part of that stakeholder conversation and making sure we have a regulatory framework that's functional for farmers in addition to meeting our obligations. And the other attachment I submitted to the committee this morning was an April 1st letter we received from EPA that was supportive of the language we shared with them in terms of those conforming changes to Title 10.
Representative Bartholomew.
Go back to one slide. The one near the bottom, explaining how ANR will regulate all farms, including small farms. That sounds like a really expansion of what you're doing now. And I thought that was not part of the bill.
So small farms are held to a different standard than medium and large farms, and may ask Catherine to give me the specific words, but essentially small farms, not only would we need to document the presence of a discharge, it would have to have I think it's a substantial impact on water quality. Catherine, can you help me?
Yes, Catherine Gessing, General Counsel for the Agency of Natural Resources. Thank you for having us today. The language is that small farms must be a significant contributor to water quality issues in the in the watershed. So that's an analysis that is orders of magnitude sort of more stringent than the requirements for large and medium farms.
So unless they have that significant contribution, you don't have to regulate them.
Correct.
So who decides, if you're not going there, who decides that a farm is doing that?
Part of
So-
It must be agriculture that starts and notifies ANR. Is that right?
You want to take that, Catherine?
Sure. Part of what we will be doing is looking at risk factors associated with small farms, as well as the Agency of Agricultural database to inform what farms we should inspect. We would also be looking at complaints. You know, we do occasionally get complaints about farms, and so does ag. So we will fashion a sort of prioritization of factors that make it more likely that a farm might have an issue, and focus on those farms initially before, for our inspection program. And it's going to take a little bit of time, obviously, because we have to build the program from the ground up. We're also looking to staff a couple more folks. So it'll take a little bit of time.
And I can appreciate the language on that screen is a little bit inelegant in that we're not going to regulate all farms, but I think it's review all farms and determine which ones need to be regulated by ANR.
So am I correct that if the Agency of Agriculture becomes aware of significant discharges on a small farm, they will be obligated to notify Natural Resources?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. I think I have just one last slide, which is kind of where we're headed next. We are working to finalize our corrective action plan with EPA and hope that will happen in fairly short order, and anticipate initiating that agricultural stakeholder engagement as soon as sort of the dust settles, I guess I would say, with the General Assembly, and making sure that we understand the full scope that it is envisioned that process will cover. We've already begun drafting revised roles and responsibilities that help clarify our roles versus AG's roles, and we'll be documenting that. There's been some requests from the AG community that we sort of wait to finalize that until after we go through the stakeholder engagement process, just so that we're not creating a set of roles and responsibilities that locks us into something that we may want to modify through that process. Staff have also begun the work necessary to update our CAFO general permit. Currently, it's a medium farm permit, and it will be reissued to be available to small, medium, and large farms. And then, as I noted earlier, we are planning to conduct 10 or lead 10 farm inspections this coming field season with input from EPA as to where to prioritize the effort.
How are you picking those farms?
So a lot of what Catherine described, some of the risk factors, past issues associated of potential non-compliance, places where EPA conducted inspections and found things they thought were concerning, and are so working to identify that list. All large farms in the state are inspected annually by the Ag Agency. Medium farms, I believe, are inspected once every 3 years. And so also looking at sort of who's coming up on the Ag Agency's docket for inspection, particularly in that medium farm space, and trying to also align ourselves with their efforts.
So what's in our CAFO general permit, and why is it currently focused on medium farms?
I think the assumption was that large farms would require an individual permit. And so the general permit was written specifically towards medium farms. We have not had any farms obtain CAFO permit coverage at this point.
And I just looked, but found an example of IPD's general permit, but where should we look to for an example for Vermont, or how do we look at this? What's the general permit, and then how do we look at an example of an individual permit?
So we haven't issued an individual permit. So I think, and again, Catherine can correct me if I'm wrong, what we really have at this point are sort of checklists and guidance for ourselves on how we would draft an individual CAFO permit, which I'm happy to provide. And we can certainly provide a link to the existing medium farm CAFO general permit.
Can you give us just a sense of like what's in, like this is a permit to discharge. But then I'm assuming then you're cleaning up
It is
It's in the discharge before you.
It's a very limited permit to discharge. It looks markedly different than a stormwater permit, which is event-based, or a wastewater permit that assumes sort of a daily ongoing discharge. The ability to discharge under a CAFO permit is really only in response to a 25-year, 24-hour storm. So it's about 3 inches of precipitation, which, 15 years ago sounded like a whole lot of water. It more recently does not. But so it allows for the fact that there are sort of extreme events that could occur, that it is unrealistic to expect a farm to be able to capture all of that rainfall. The CAFO permit emphasizes heavily the farmstead, or the production area, as opposed to fields. And really, when it comes to fields, the question is, do you have a nutrient management plan that meets federal and state standards to the extent there are state standards? And are you following it? And if you sort of meet those obligations in terms of implementation of your nutrient management plan, runoff from farm fields is treated as agricultural stormwater, which is exempt from CAFO oversight. So really what we're focused on with a CAFO permit is discharges leaving the production area, right? The manure, silage, leachate, milk house wastewater, those by and large in Vermont farms are directed to the farm's manure pit at this point. If they are not able to reach the manure pit, if the manure pit lacks sufficient capacity to provide 180 days of storage, along with some amount of freeboard, which is space at the top for that 25-year, 24-hour storm event, those are all the kinds of factors we're looking at and considering. But it is very different than a discharge permit that would otherwise be issued to a wastewater or a stormwater facility, where it anticipates much more frequent discharges.
Thank you for that.
Catherine, is there anything you need to clean up there on my behalf?
And no, I don't need to clean up anything. I just would add that the Department of, Ag has very similar standards. They have fashioned their regulatory program around some of the federal requirements. And so there may not be significant changes for most farms associated with a CAFO permit versus an ag permit. There are some, limited exceptions to that, but nutrient management plans are based on, the natural resource and our RCS standards, and farms are very familiar with those standards now because they've been required to those standards
Translation.
under the
Sure, Catherine,
jurisdiction
you were
of
breaking
ag.
up. You were breaking up a little bit. So it's just nutrient management plans are, the ag agency requires farms to develop nutrient management plans consistent with NRCS, what they call their 590 standard. So it's a standard practice that provides pretty clear framework and instructions for developing a nutrient management plan. CAFO permits also require that same thing. So most farms at this point have a 590 compliant nutrient management plan that should be sufficient to either allow to support a large farm or medium farm permit to be issued from the ag agency, or a CAFO permit to be issued from ANR. But it's the same planning framework in both instances.
Thank you. Okay, we have a couple questions and then we're going to need to move on. Representative Austin and then Norris.
If the APA suddenly said, we're not going to oversee this, the regulations, anything, is the state still committed to the implementation, I think, of policies in S 124?
Yes, and part of that is the recourse for the petitioners, for CLF in this case, isn't actually with EPA. It would be to move the litigation to federal court. So they could continue, if EPA sort of stepped back, my understanding is the petitioners could continue to pursue the concerns they have raised. And so it makes sense both from a legal perspective, but also from an environmental perspective to continue to move this work forward.
Representative North.
Thank you, Secretary. So it seems like the primary change being made here, and implemented in S-124 is really just a changing of responsibility for the department, or the ag agency to A&I. Aside from that, what real changes are being made in S-124? And is that really going to make any difference?
So I think it is where you have farms that are in that in-between space, right? If a farm is not having a discharge, CAFO permit will not apply. It's more what happens if a discharge is located, and the idea that you would need to have a established compliance schedule for addressing those discharges that's satisfactory to the agency and meets our obligations under the Clean Water Act. Our expectation is it's a relatively modest number of Vermont farms that will have discharges at this point, as they have been being regulated by the Agency of Agriculture, large farms for more than 20 years. But we won't know until we get out on the ground. But it should only have feel like a change for those farms that have an active discharge that can't be immediately corrected.
It's really just closing that time gap.
Correct.
We're seeing the allowance of time to fix the problem.
Correct. Exactly.
Representative Austin. Oh, all right. Thank you for joining us.
You're welcome.
You're off to another committee, and
I am.
we are shifting gears also. Members, let's take a 5-minute break, and our